Hello and welcome to So Crafty. Today I wanted to show you how to make an easy t-shirt memory quilt. They're fun and a good way to use up those extra t-shirts that you may have, and they also make great gifts. They're fairly easy to do. So let's go ahead and get started with the supplies that you need. First thing you need to do is just gather all of your t-shirts that you want to make into the quilt. You're also going to need some lightweight interfacing, the iron-on kind. You're going to need some fabric for the back of your quilt, and you're going to need some batting, a square ruler, scissors or a rotary cutter, and an iron. Any ruler can work, but I find that the square ruler works better. These are my supplies that I'm going to use, and I have two different sizes of the rulers. And because I don't know what size I'm going to cut a t-shirt, because if you notice, some t-shirts have a bigger design than others, and then some have a smaller design. So the t-shirts that have the smaller design, I will use the smaller square ruler. First, you're going to just take one of your t-shirts, and I just cut the sleeves off first just to kind of get them out of the way, and then I cut the shoulders so I can open it up and cut each design out separately. And then I'll cut the sides as well so I can, cut each one separately. And this is just a fast way that I'm doing it. I'm just cutting it both the same side at the same time. These designs on this particular t-shirt are not very big, so it doesn't matter, how well I cut the sides. If they're a big design, you want to make sure that you cut them pretty evenly. And so I took my first square, and I noticed that was a little bit too small. So I'm going to take my bigger square, and I'm just going to stretch out the t-shirt as much as I can. And I try not to get the collar apart because that might be a little hard to sew. But I'm just taking my rotary cutter and I'm just cutting around my square, and I'm going to use this as my set design size. So these are going to be the size of my squares, and just make it easy for yourself. I mean, make all the squares the same size. That's what I do just to make it the easiest. It's going to be a lot easier for you when you're setting it together. Now I have my second t-shirt, and it has a design on the front and the back. So I'm going to cut my sleeves off, and then I'm going to cut the shoulders, and I will also cut the sides as well, so I can have each side, front and back of the t-shirt, separated, so it's easier for me to cut the square. Now, I had said before, when you lay down your t-shirt to cut the square out, you stretch it out as much as you can. What I actually meant by that is smooth out the t-shirt, not necessarily stretch the t-shirt, but just to kind of clarify, just lay your t-shirt flat like this, and then just kind of smooth it out and make sure there's no wrinkles or anything like that. So not necessarily stretch it, but just kind of smooth it out. So again, for this design, I'm going to take the bigger square, and I'm going to cut around it with the rotary cutter. And again, I'm missing the collar. And what I'm doing is I am kind of putting the square in the center, or putting the design in the center of the square. And it's pretty easy to do with these kinds of rulers, with the X in the middle and so on. So now I'm just going to take the excess, and that part will just be thrown away. And I'm just going to set that aside. And now I'm going to take the other side and do the same thing. Just take my ruler. Again, the smaller ruler is just not not big enough for that. And so I'm going to take my bigger ruler and just cut around it. And I think the smaller ruler I have is a 12 inch. This one is also a 12 inch, but it has an extra half inch or an inch on each side because it's one of those row cutter rulers, and there's slits in the center And so it's easier to cut like jelly rolls or something like that. But it's also really good to cut around the edge for your t-shirts. Okay, now I'm going to get another t-shirt and I'm going to do the same exact thing. I wanted to show y'all several examples of how I cut these out. And it's just the same exact thing, assembly line. First, cut your sleeves off, cut the shoulders, and then I cut the sides. And I'll kind of fold it sideways and put the sides together and cut them at the same time, just to save time. You might find that there's another method that you have that is faster, easier, better for you. And that's totally fine. As you start to make these, you'll find your own niches that work for you best. This is just how I do it. Now I believe this one was easy enough, was small enough to use the smaller ruler, so I used that one, I believe. And then I kind of guesstimate, I put all of my squares together when I'm laying it out, and then it kind of works well because two of these will match up with the bigger square almost. And usually I have enough on either end to overlap if I need to, and I'll show you an example of that too as I lay them out. So here's the back of that same shirt, or this is the front, I believe. And I believe I used the same smaller square fabric, the ruler for it to cut it out. And so that, yeah, it works out well for that one. So I just continue cutting out several squares out of t-shirts, and I try to show you several examples and several design sizes that may come on a t-shirt. Like for the next t-shirt, it's just a smaller design, but if you notice, I still use the same size ruler no matter what size the design is. And I'm doing that because it's just so much easier when you start to put them together, when you're sewing them together, to have the squares the same size. It's a time saver. And so I continue to do that with these shirts. I just keep cutting them out. And here I am cutting the sides on this one. And then notice that, well, I'm doing the big design first. And I think I used the big ruler for that because the other one was too small. And I'm smoothing it out so there's no wrinkles. And so I'm taking the bigger ruler and then I'm cutting these out. And you kind of got to be careful with the smaller t-shirts because you don't want to cut the sides and then it gets into your design on each edge. But right now what I'm doing is measuring out that it's center. So I was making sure there were the same inches on each side. And then I just take the excess and like I said before, that will be discarded. Alright, so I set that one aside and then I get the other side of the t-shirt. Or no, I didn't do that part because I saved it to see if I was going to use it later. And I believe I did, and I did use the same size square. And so I continue just to cut them out. And like I said, I'm showing y'all several examples here because, t-shirts have all different kinds of designs, sizes of designs. So this is the last one that I show y'all to cut out. I think I had, I don't know, I think I had 120 t-shirts to cut out because I was making 2 t-shirt quilts for twin boys. So I finished that, and now I'm going to iron the interfacing on the back of the t-shirts. And you want to do that because if you try to sew it the way it is, it's just going to be a total nightmare. And so sewing it or ironing it onto the interfacing makes it easier to sew. Now knit is hard enough to sew by itself on the sewing machine, and that's what obviously t-shirts are made of. So what I do first is I've just kind of roughly measured my interfacing, and I cut like I think whatever 12, 13 inches wide, and then interfacing comes a little bit longer than 12 inches. And so what I'm doing now is just trimming it off, so it'll be easier to iron on, and I'm not wasting a whole bunch of interfacing. And actually what I will do with that part that I cut off, I'll either use it for embroidery on as stabilizer, or I will take several of those strips and just iron it on to one t-shirt, one t-shirt square, because if you save 4, 5, 6 of them, and you could just overlap them on the back of a square and use those up, and that way you don't have any waste. So that's what I'm doing with this, and I'm just taking the lightweight interfacing. I think you can use lightweight or featherweight. Either one works okay. You don't want to get a thick interfacing because that will just be too thick as you're sewing it. But that's what I'm doing now, just cutting the interfacing to match the t-shirt squares that I cut out. Now we're ready to iron the interfacing on the back of the t-shirt squares. I wanted to kind of cut and measure first, makes it a little bit easier. So what I do is the interfacing has a bumpy side on one side and then a smooth side on the other side. The bumpy side is the part that needs to go on the back of the t-shirt. So you want to make sure that you iron these to the back of the t-shirt. And again, put the bumpy part of the interfacing on the bumpy side facing the fabric, on the side of the fabric, the back side of the t-shirt, if that makes sense. Sorry, I feel like I'm just kind of rambling. But so that's how you do iron on the interfacing. And again, when you're ironing on, just kind of touch it. Just kind of touch it down. I wouldn't iron back and forth like you usually do with a shirt. You can do that some, I guess, after it's already been ironed on. But it's better if you just kind of lay it down, lay your iron down, and then pick it up. Or kind of like what I'm doing now, I'm going towards putting it down in the middle and then going out towards the sides. Because if you try to just go all over it, it'll kind of scrunch up, and it'll just mess up. So just kind of get down, put in the middle, put your iron in the middle, and just kind of move it out towards the sides like that. And again, you want to make sure the bumpy side of the interfacing is on the back side of your t-shirt. So the design is up on the front. And sometimes if you see it's not sticking, just go over it again, and it should work pretty well. And then the most important thing is to make sure that your edges are ironed on pretty good, because that's the part that you sew, and you want it to be stuck to the t-shirt so it'll be easier to sew with this interfacing. And that's what interfacing basically does, is it just makes things easier to sew. And so I continue doing that with all the squares that I have got cut out. And again, kind of just move it, put it in the middle, and then iron out. Put it in the middle and slide it out. And don't move it all the way over, all over the square, because again, it'll most likely bunch it up. Especially this featherweight interfacing. The thicker interfacing probably be okay to do that, but this lighter weight is very, very thin, obviously. And I don't even think I have my iron on the hottest setting because it'll just melt it too. So make sure when you're using this thinner interfacing to not put your iron on the hottest setting. And then after I get through ironing the back, I check the sides or the edges to make sure that the interfacing is indeed stuck to the edges. So it'll be easier to sew. And so I just continue doing that on all of my squares, ironing the interfacing on the back of my t-shirt squares. One more thing I do want to add when you're ironing the interfacing, don't iron over the design. If you iron over the design, it's going to melt it or it will somewhat mess it up because that's basically what the t-shirt is. That design is ironed on and it will smear it and it will mess up the design. So always iron the interfacing on the back. And I don't touch the t-shirt. I just touch the interfacing on the back. And so next I'm doing let's see what I'm doing the same thing, and I'm just ironing, I'm just stretching these out and just making sure that it's all laid straight, and then I'm still ironing the interfacing on. And like I said before, make sure you iron your iron is touching the interfacing and not the front of the t-shirt where the design is. Now, if you need to iron the front of the t-shirt, on the parts where there is no design on the edge, you could do that too. That would be all right. But if you have some interfacing sticking out, it may still kind of melt it. So this was a different day, and I'm doing a different. I'm just kind of doing it a different way, where well, this one has, yeah, I'm doing it the same way here. I've got the t-shirt with the interfacing already on there with it. It's not ironed yet, but I just kind of keep them together and it makes it kind of go a little faster. And then also when you're ironing, make sure that your t-shirt squares are kind of nice and smoothed out when you're ironing this on, because if you don't, the t-shirt can curl up on the edge, kind of like knit can, and then it will be ironed onto the interfacing curled up. So you definitely don't want that. You just want it all smoothed out while you're ironing it. Once I get them all ironed, now I'm just going to kind of trim off the excess of the interfacing. If you do that, it will make it a lot easier to sew because you'll be able to see the edges of the squares easier. Now, if you have a little bit of interfacing hanging off, that's okay. But if you have a lot, I would recommend trimming it off. And as you can see, I just take a ruler and my rotary cutter and just lay it on the edge of it and then just trim it off. Now, make sure that, your ruler is at the edge of the t-shirt, because you don't want to cut any excess off of the t-shirt because you have already cut that perfect square. And you want to make sure that they have that same size. It'd be easier for you to lay it out and design it with all the squares being the same size. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just trimming off the excess interfacing after I ironed all the interfacing onto the back of each square. And again, it'll just make it easier for you to sew and see the edges of the t-shirt squares when you're sewing. Okay, now here's a picture of all the t-shirts that I have done for one quilt. They're all ironed with interfacing and ready to lay out. And that's what I'm fixing to do here. I've sped this part up a little bit, but what I'm doing now is I'm just kind of laying them out into a design that I like. And as you can see, what I'm doing is I like to put a dark color and then a light color and then a dark color and a light color and so forth. And so that's what I'm doing with these. And then I'm just kind of making sure that the designs are, there's a different design everywhere. Now, if you notice, the first 3 rows I've laid down are the smaller squares. And so now I'm laying down the 4th row. The first 4 are the larger squares, and then now I'm laying down the larger squares now too. But if you notice, the last row with the green and the blue and the white, those are 3 of the 12-inch squares, the smaller squares, and I have put those 3 together because I'm going to make those the same size as the 2 rows that are the bigger squares. And that works out too because they may have more or they may have less of the design on the end, and so I'll be able to sew those with a bigger seam, and it'll still match up, and I'll show you how that is done too. So right now that's what I'm doing. I'm laying this out, and this quilt size is the size of this quilt was bigger than a king size quilt. That picture that you saw at the very beginning, that quilt was laying on a king size bed, and as you can tell, the end of it was kind of hanging off the bed pretty good. So this was definitely larger than a king size quilt, and so you need a pretty big space to lay it out. And I've done it in my foyer before because I had a double size king size quilt, and so I laid it in my foyer to make it so I could have enough room. But this one I was able to lay out in my spare bedroom, which is right next to my sewing room, so I didn't have far to travel when I would sew them together. And again, I'm still laying them out and making the design that I want. Okay, and so here they are all laid out before I've sewn them together. So I've got my design and how I want it, and what I do is I take a picture of it. Here's the second one that I did, but I take a picture of it to make sure I know where the squares go, and I have taken my shoes off, and now I'm going to sew the first row. And so what I'm doing is folding that one over on that first one because I know those 2 are going to be sewn first, and I'm just picking them up and laying on top of the next one so I know the order that they are in. And again, like I said, take a picture of it so that way if you forget or you're not too sure, you can always look back at that picture and see the way it was, the way you had first laid it out and the design, and get your squares accordingly. But this is how I pick up each square to lay them on top of each other to know what order to sew them in. So, and I'll sew from the right to the left. And so the first one I took and I laid it on top of that second one, and also those 2 together on the right hand side, and then I'll just continue adding the other ones to it as well. So here it is right here. So I've got those first 2 that I first picked up. That first one was the first one that I laid on top of the second square. And so as you can see, I'm lining up the edges of it, and I think I'm using a 3/8 of a seam allowance. And so I'm sewing those 2 together first. And then I'll know when I picked it up that other one that's laying there is going to go on the left side of the white square. Now the sewing machine I'm using is a little Janome. So I've sewed those two together and they look good. And so now I'm going to take that next square, and I turned it upside down because it's easier to sew since your sewing machine is kind of sewn on the you have to have everything hanging out on the left hand side. So I turned it upside down to make sure that I'm going the right way with it. And so again, I'm using a 3/8 of a seam allowance, and then I'll just continue sewing each square together, and this will be the first row. And like I was saying before, this is a little Janome sewing machine that I'm using. I usually have a Fob, but it was in the getting worked on, and so I was kind of worried about doing these two big old T-shirt quilts on this little machine because she needed it by a certain time. But it seemed to work out fine. I mean, it worked really good. So this is a good little machine. So I took the next square and I'm adding it on to the same row. So basically I'm just sewing rows. And then they can be pretty slippery, and so they'll slide off. So if you have a bigger table, you could just kind of lay it over the table, and I do that eventually. But I mean it's not that big of a deal. I suppose I'm used to it. I've made so many of these. So again, I'm just using a 3-inch seam allowance, and I'm just sewing the edges, and then I'm opening it up to make sure that I have gotten the t-shirt in the seam, because sometimes you might cut it a little weird, or there might be something wrong with the t-shirt. Maybe it had a hole in it or something. So you want to make sure that when you get through sewing it, you open it up and make sure that you actually did get the whole t-shirt in the seam, because you don't want any kind of little hole sticking out. So I'm just going to continue adding each square to this top row, to this first row, and then in the order that they are laid down, and adding it to the right side with it upside down. So I've gone ahead and sped up this part so you can see. I think I'm sewing the first 3 rows, but I just kind of went ahead and sped it up so you can see I'm doing the same thing. And a lot of people, like to see it over and over again. So I wanted to make sure that I give you several examples of me sewing these rows together, so you'll be able to have a good reference to go look back. So I finished that row, and now I'm getting out. I think this is the second row, and I'm continuing sewing them. Again, I took the first one that was laying on facing down on the second one, and I'm sewing them together on the right. And then you have to turn them upside down because I'm sewing it from the left to the right. And so you have to have it upside down so it matches it up. And then I just continue to sew this row together, and then I think I have one more row that I sew together as well. So here I am working on the third row, and I think I ended up sewing them all together, all the rows together, but I finished the third row, and so now I have all the rows sewn together, and now I'm going to connect those first three rows. And so the way I do that is I lay them all out flat in the order that they're supposed to be, and then I start from the center and I pin them at the edge. I match up the edges. I take the top one and put it face down on the second one, and I'm pinning them together and making sure the edges are matched up and making sure that the seams are matched up. Now sometimes the seams won't match up, and that's okay. Um, if they don't, when you start to quilt it, you can just kind of stop wherever it doesn't match up. But now if you want them to match up, then just make sure you sew them straight, the exact same uh, width and that kind of thing. And so just this is what I'm doing. I have just pinned the top two together, and then I sewed them together using a 3-inch seam allowance. So those top two are sewed together, and then now I've laid those back down, and I am pinning the third row together, and I have flipped it up on top of the second row, and now I'm pinning it together, matching up the edges. And then again, some of the seams won't line up, but that is because I had to kind of do a redesign to make it look right and not have two colors together. But that's okay, because you're going to trim the edge and you're going to bind it, so that'll be covered. And sometimes the designs aren't going to be completely there, and that's okay too. If you get the majority of it, that's all that matters. But sometimes it just works out that way. And so now I don't know where the video is to the one that I sewed the first two together. I think I lost it. But anyway, so now I'm pinning the third row to the first and second row that I sewed together. And again, I'm matching up the edges. Normally I don't pin, but something like this long, I would recommend pinning it, or you could use those clips, whatever works best for you. And then just make sure the edges are lined up. And then so now here it is, all sewn together, and it looks pretty good. A quilt this size, not all of the seams are going to match up, but they come very close. And so here this one is all sewn together. Now I'm going to lay the backing down. You want to lay the backing down first before you lay the batting down. I had to sew two pieces of fabric together because of the size of this quilt. So I've sewed them, and then I laid the backing down first, and then I put the batting on. So here's the batting that I put down. And it's a little tricky getting everything straight, but you find out your methods. I just kind of start in the middle and just kind of scoot around and just kind of make sure it's all straight. And I put heavy things in the corner too, and I pull it just to make sure it's all straight. And so now I've laid the t-shirt quilt, or the t-shirt top, onto the batting. And so that's how you want to do the quilt: backing, batting, and then the t-shirt top. And now I pinned it all together, and so now what I'm doing is I'm quilting it. So what I'm doing is I'm stitching in the ditch. And it can get bulky, it can get frustrating, and yeah, it can be pretty difficult at times. But one thing you can do is if you can see on the right hand side, I am rolling it up to fit in the neck of my sewing machine, and then I'm just making sure everything else is straight, and I'm just holding it stretched out. And it's just, I think I might have a table too next to my desk, what that I'm sewing on. And so that way I'm able to have it, draped over too, and it gets heavy. And so basically you just kind of find your niche and find out what works for you. And so as I'm going to the next stitch in the ditch, I'm rolling it up on the side. And then again, the pins, I've pinned it. I have pinned every square because when you're quilting something, you want to make sure that you pin all three layers together really well so it doesn't shift. And so that's what I did. I thought I had a picture of that, but I guess I don't. But anyway, so just know after you lay down your backing and then your batting and then your quilt top, just pin it all the way around. And so now I'm just quilting it and I'm just doing stitch in the ditch. That's one of the easiest things to do. And I have lengthened my stitch on my sewing machine, not too much, but just a little bit. And so that's what I'm doing now. I'm just quilting it and then I'm just moving it around, and then at times I'm going to have to pull it out and I'm going to have to turn it over and do the other side because sometimes it just gets too bulky. This size, it just won't fit in the neck. So you have to get pretty tricky with it, but it ends up working. It ends up working out nicely. So again, I'm just continuing to stitch in the ditch, and then I just go down one side, top to bottom, because that seems to work out well. And again, these are just very simple, and they're very easy, and that this is just a simple way to do a t-shirt quilt. Okay, now that I have it all quilted, I've laid it out again straight, and now I'm going to trim off the excess of the backing and the batting, and so I just make sure that it's all straightened up. And I'm just going to go around, and now I'm just trimming off the excess of the backing because now I want to create the binding. And I'm going to go around the whole quilt and just trimming it off. I'm trimming off, I'd say I'm leaving at least about 2 or 3 inches around the edge of the quilt. So because what this is a built-in binding. So I made sure that my backing was larger than my quilt top. And you also kind of want to make sure in some places, it doesn't have to be, but if your batting's a little bit larger, that's okay too. But it doesn't have to be. But I'm making sure that my batting was larger than my quilt top. And so now I have a built-in binding. And I'm trimming it off, and I'm going to use the excess backing that I have left, and I'm going to turn that into the binding part. And what I do is I start in the middle at one end. I'm at the top right there. I'm starting at the middle and I'm folding it once towards the edge of the quilt, and then I'm folding the whole thing again over the edge of the quilt, and that will enclose the edge of the batting as well as the edge of the t-shirt, the quilt top. So I'm going to do that for each of the 4 sides. And again, I know you can't see right now, but I'm in the top and I'm at the corner. And so I did start in the middle, and then I just worked my way around each of the 4 sides, starting in the middle. And what I'm doing too is as I'm folding it over, I'm pinning it to make sure that it stays in place and it doesn't move. And when you get to the corners, What I do is I just fold those the same exact way, and then whenever I get to the other side, it'll fold itself over as well. So as you can see now I'm still at the top, and I started in the middle, and I'm just kind of folding it over. If you have any questions about this part, feel free to message me. I guess I should have done a close-up video of this part so you could see it a little better. But again, I'll explain what I'm doing. I'm starting in the middle, and I'm taking the edge of the black backing, and I'm folding the edge of the black backing to the edge of the quilt, and then I'm folding it over again to where it encloses the edge of the quilt and the batting. And you might can see a little bit better here. And I'm pretty much just kind of rolling it over. And then once I get to the edge, I'm just doing the same exact thing, and each one will pretty much fold over itself. And this is just a beginner tutorial. You can miter the corners and all that, but that gets pretty advanced. But this is just a simple way to do a t-shirt quilt. It's a quick way, and it's for a beginner as well. And so you may can see there a little bit better what I did. Taking the edge of the backing and folding it matching up towards the edge of the quilt, and then folding it over a second time to where it encloses the batting and the top of the t-shirt quilt. Alright, now I've got the binding all ready to go. I've got it pinned over all four sides of the quilt, and now all I'm doing is I'm just sewing the binding down, and I'm sewing it over the top of the quilt, because first of all, this was a built-in binding that I did, and it's easier to see and make sure that you are actually sewing it. And so that's really all I'm doing. I'm just moving it down and moving the quilt with it, and then whenever I get to the corners, I'll just pivot around and then stitch those down as well. And that's it. I do have a table next to this desk because of the size of the quilt, so it's easier to kind of hold it all up, because it's so heavy that if I don't have that table there, it'll hang off the edge, and it might want to slide and move around, and it's just it's a little bit too heavy. So but anyway, this is what I'm doing. This is the last step of sewing. You sew the binding down all the way around. I'm sewing probably about 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the binding. You want to sew as close to the edge of the binding as you can, just to make sure you get it tacked down. And so this is pretty much the last step. Once you get through sewing the binding down, all you have left to do is cut the loose threads. At this point, it was just easier for me to have the quilt hang down off of the side of the table. And I think because I turned the table, if you see where the red cover cloth is, I turned that into a big ironing board, which I also have a video for that. So if you want to see that, feel free to check it out. And I'll try to add it at the top right here. But I think it was just kind of bulking up, and that big red cloth was just not, it was making it kind of harder to just kind of move around. So I eventually just kind of did have it draped off of my desk. But it's your preference. Sometimes it's better to do that. Sometimes it's better not. It's just whatever is easiest for you to do. Now I'm coming to the end of sewing the binding on. I think this is my last little piece right here, and then I get through sewing it, and then I cut all my loose threads off, and here it is completed. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and I sure appreciate you watching. Thank you so much.